Let me take this moment to introduce John Wilson, also known as Farmer John J.D. Wilson. He's a carpenter, he's a farmer, he's a writer. He was born in Indiana, but he is a longtime resident of Virginia Beach. He is the owner of John Capstone Creations in Virginia Beach and the founder of New Earth Farm in Virginia Beach. John has written for the Virginia Association for Biological Farming, which is the statewide organic farming organization. He is also on the board of the Virginia Food Shed. He still farms and works as a carpenter, garden designer, and builder in the Tidewater area. John studied organic farming and gardening at Goddard College in 1977, and through the years has continued to study quality composting and soil science. Currently, he owns Farmer John's Market in Virginia Beach, which is a 2-acre farm near Kempsville and Centerville Turnpike, right, called the Farmhouse Brewery. John is still involved actively in making compost for the garden building business, where he sells compost, biochar, seeds, bedding plants, worm castings, and soil amendments. He's ready with gardening and growing advice, and of course, tasty, nutritious vegetables, fruits, flowers, and herbs. John's contact information is at the top. It's one of the first 2 things in the chat room. So if you have questions and you go to the chat room, you can look there at the very top. It gives you a couple of websites for John. John's going to share with us this evening the importance of urban agriculture, how to stretch the period of time you can harvest vegetables, and ways to improve your garden fertility. Welcome, Farmer John. We're so anxious to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I used to be shy. Now I love to talk, and especially about this. And so I really appreciate the invitation. And I guess I didn't write my bio very well, but yeah, the site is called Farmer John's Market on Kempsville Road. And it's on the site of the Farmhouse Brewery. And I also should have emphasized more my association as a board member of the Virginia Food Shed. It's an important organization that's growing, and there's some people there doing a really good job making it expand and, and supporting small local farmers all over the state. So I can't even begin to cover everything I like to talk about. So I'm going to control myself at some points. You might see me pause and say, okay, sidebar, you can wait until another time. I want to start with a couple of quotes from 2 of our former presidents. One is Thomas Jefferson. Cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. They are the most vigorous, the most independent, and the most virtuous, and are tied to their country and wedded to its liberty by the most lasting bands. Another one by Abe Lincoln. The greatest fine art of the future will be the making of a comfortable living from a small piece of land. I couldn't find another quote that Abe Lincoln had, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, which was something like, no country whose every citizen possesses these arts can ever be conquered by any invader. So I thought those were pretty big statements to make. And so when I'm rich and famous, someone will quote this one. This is my quote. Or you can quote it now if you want. We have all the solutions we need right now in our hands to solve every problem, many of them going unused in both agriculture and energy. I say energy because I also used to be a solar builder briefly, and it's another big story. So I think it's important to know that we have all of these solutions, and they're all actually easy to obtain. And one of the biggest things it takes to obtain them is a mindset, a way of thinking. And changing a way of thinking is the hardest thing to do for most people. The other things we need are techniques, processes, and knowledge, and patience. So I can give you some knowledge and tell you some techniques. You're on your own with the patience. I say that patience because in organic farming, they say it takes a minimum of 3 years to really develop a soil ecosystem, unless you have the money and the wherewithal to really dump a lot of compost and biochar into your soil. So, and next I'll say that the topic of urban agriculture, I think, is very, very important and very timely. I believe it always was, and I think it's even more so now. And I say that because of things like when the COVID thing started. Now, of course, we can't grow toilet paper in a garden, but you know, this same thing was happening on the shelves of food as it was with toilet paper. People get spooked, and all of a sudden, the food, you know, shelves are empty. So good for you all to choose this topic. And I really strongly encourage you all to follow up with more study and action. And that book list I provided, I don't know if I said it there, but it's a short book list. I've read many, many books and a lot of good ones, and I tried to put a few key ones that I remembered in there. And some people are now saying that we have 60 years left of usable soil and harvests in our current trajectory of how much soil we're losing in our farmland based on both soil and water erosion. And one of the books I mentioned called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization highlights that. So that's not very many. Now, I'm going to guess we have an older, mostly group here, like myself, so we won't see what happens in 60 years. But I mean, for example, there's another, according to an article in the Smithsonian magazine, they were talking about enough dust was accumulating in the atmosphere that, you know, we could be heading for another dust bowl. Now, with all the rain we've had this year, I find that hard to believe, but I'm not an atmospheric scientist. Although I want to cover briefly the carbon sequestration in healthy soils. And the new word is regenerative that people are using. And so urban agriculture doesn't completely address that the same way the large acres of farms do, but you still can play your part. And so I will first mention a few examples, and there are many, and I could have researched and found many examples of urban agriculture, but 3 that I'm going to mention. One is historic in France, and I should have had the years that they were doing this in front of me, but I didn't. There was a time period before heavy mechanizations and where you know, horse-drawn buggies and etc. were the mode of transportation. They had lots of manure available. But in and around Paris, and with some other techniques, which again, I can't cover every single thing, they grew enough food for the whole city. I don't know the population either, but also, again, urban agriculture, they also exported to other parts of Europe. And they are the same latitude as we are in Virginia Beach. So they did it then, we could do it now. And one of my horticulture teachers, Alan Chadwick, had studied with people who knew techniques. I mean, he went to Paris and studied with some of those people who were still practicing some of those things. And it's deep soils. That's a big thing. And there's a lot of resilience that occurs when you do soils properly. But, you know, to be able to grow all the food you need in your own city and export some, that's urban agriculture. The next one I want to mention is a few years ago, and please ignore your thoughts about politics, but in Cuba, they have what they call the special period. So yeah, again, I'm just talking about agriculture here, not socialism or whatever they had or have. Right after Russia pulled out of Cuba, they were subsidized lock, stock, and barrel for everything. There was a 3-year period where Cubans, the average Cuban apparently lost 30 pounds. They were in big trouble. And some organizations came in to help them, notably the permaculture people. And within this 3-year special period, they developed an island-wide food system. And every little scrap of anything that could grow a tomato or anything was used. And they also gathered some of their older farmers who were not useful under, you know, the Russian time period, and brought some of their mules and horses out and started growing grains a little outside of the cities. But 3 years is a pretty short amount of time to create a complete diet for your city, your island in their case. And it's worth studying how they did it. Another one, which is a little sad for me to talk about, is Growing Power in Milwaukee is more recent. And because they've gone out of business, or I don't know that part of the story, but Will Allen, a former professional basketball player, started it. It's called Growing Power in Milwaukee. And they had lots of greenhouses, a lot of season extension techniques, because Milwaukee's colder than Virginia Beach. And they grew a lot of food on a city 3-acre plot with greenhouses. And they did a lot of worm composting and had Milwaukee's famous beers. So they had barley mash to compost and let worms, you know, have something to eat. And that provided their fertility. And when I heard Will talk once, he said he could put a 2-foot pile of soil and worm castings right on asphalt and grow beautiful produce for 2 years without adding anything to it. So one thing I'm going to cover in here, and I'm going to try to stick to my my list of how I present it, but I'll talk more about worms. I will say this, that part of what I'm talking about here is decentralizing the food system and the fertility system. And where do we have the most compostable material? In cities and neighborhoods and suburbs. And there's enough there, once a system is established, to provide the fertility, along with a couple of other little things that I'll mention in a minute, to really grow community gardens, urban agriculture, school gardens. Yeah, I forgot to mention in my bio, I've done a lot of school gardens as well over the years and helped begin several community gardens, mostly by a little advice and some of my compost. And so those three are the ones I wanted to mention. And I know there are many more community gardens, urban agriculture, and other types of urban agriculture. And of course, I just mentioned one is school gardens, one is community gardens. One is small plots as businesses that people can find and rent. Another is there are people who are actually going into neighborhoods and renting backyards of, let's say, 10 neighborhood households. And they make a deal where they get a certain amount of food. And then this person tends 10 gardens and 10 yards and has a little business and delivers produce somewhere. And I just looked down and saw churches have land also. Guess where a lot of land is? Schools and churches. And the city also has a lot of land here and there. And I have helped start community gardens on a couple of church lots. But all of these things, especially well, all of them, community gardens, school gardens, it really requires, and it usually ends up being one person, to be strongly interested and organizing and committed and a problem solver. Some of the best school gardens I've started where I've gone back, year after year and I'll talk to kids and do a little class, but deliver compost again. It requires, each of these items requires leadership. And until some of these things are more economically active, it usually is volunteers. But I think it's super important, this idea of decentralizing the food system. Our food system, the way it's set up, would be easy to disrupt in a variety of ways. And what we're decentralizing again is food production, food distribution, and fertility creation, as in neighborhood composting. And as I mentioned, and it's important to note, some people say we have 60 years left of food production because of how we're treating the land and losing the soil. And currently, in California is growing 1/3 of the vegetables for the whole country. They're growing 2/3 of the fruit and nuts. So, disrupt California, and we've got some problems with our food systems. And right now, California is in they're in a terrible condition with water. I don't know how they're doing this year, but droughts, fires, land is sinking. In some places, I forget the numbers exactly, but I'm going to say as much as 10 feet, the soil has dropped. And they keep track of it because of sucking the aquifers, not dry yet, but so much water. And I wish I had the numbers on. Almonds alone require, some amazing number of gallons of water per each tree or each pound of almonds. And partly that's due to poor soil management, because you can literally store thousands of gallons of water in 1 acre of land when you treat the soil properly. And I'll mention more about that in just a second. So anyway, urban agriculture, I think, is going to be more and more important all the time in our future. And it separates us from the vulnerability of big problems somewhere where so much of our food comes from. And in fact, that story about France and so forth, there's also, I've read about it, the actual stories, but for now I'm going to say it's anecdotal. They say in France during World War II, the average French person fared much better during the war because they still had a village by village food system. And even if all their food was taken, and one village during a march through, they ended up having a little black market for produce of other villages that weren't affected. And so that's the resilience of decentralizing, and that's the resilience of ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems, I'm sure most of you have heard some of this information about trees and mycorrhizal fungi and how the whole forest will share water and nutrients underground through mycorrhizal fungi. And so that's how we could be treating our food system as well. We could mimic nature in that way. And let's see where I am now. So I'll just talk a little bit about, I'll wait on that. So again, why urban agriculture? Food security for everybody. If there's community gardens everywhere, then everybody could have a stake in it. And national security, according to Abe Lincoln. And I mean, I heard an Army general say the same kind of thing at one point. And I wish I remembered his name, but he was asked, what's the biggest threat we face today? And he said something about water and food security. So I was kind of stunned. I just happened on it. So why else urban agriculture? Fresh, healthy food, nutritionally dense food, and there's so much information out there about the nutrient dense food, how it's grown, and how much nutrients are lacking in our food today from our current ag system, and how it can be grown again. And it's apparently done better if you just look at statistics on smaller operations. So also it's a smaller carbon footprint. If your food's traveling a mile or down the block or 20 miles, it's not traveling 3,000. I don't know if that's still the number, but at one time they were saying the average plate of food traveled 2,000 or 3,000 miles to get to you. That's a big carbon footprint. And it's also useful as jobs for more people. And in my mind, as a gardener and farmer, those are good jobs, healthy jobs. And I just don't think you can overstate the benefit to people, their health, their vitality, positive outlook on life when they learn to grow their own food. It becomes empowering and fun. And if you have community gardens and urban agriculture, it doesn't have to be a full-time job for a person. There could be lots of variations of how this is done. I myself have done harm to my inner thermostats by being out in the heat too long a couple of times, and now I have to go in when it's too hot. So, you know, we can share that work now. So decentralizing the fertility, and that is simple for me. Composting is the answer to that. And what you accomplish there is take a lot of stuff out of the truck that's going to the landfill, and it's useful stuff, kitchen scraps. And so if you decentralize that as well, and you can do either thermophilic composting or vermicomposting, which is with worms. Thermophilic just means bacteria and fungus are doing the work for you. And I've started, my composting business is thermophilic. I have large windrows, 55-yard long windrows under breathable tarps. But for what I'm talking about now and for backyard fertility creation, I'm a big believer in worm composting, which is vermicomposting. And I'm also now starting to make worm bins with two sides for homeowners, so you can fill one up and then let it get ready, and then start filling the other side, and the worms move over. But I'm going to make up a number here but it would have to be worked out. But for this decentralizing our fertility, I'm going to just say for every 10,000 people, or for every community garden or urban agriculture site, we should have a small scale or mid-sized scale. And that's the book on worm composting I have in there. She talks about mid-size vermicomposting. But either for every 10,000 people or 5,000 people or every neighborhood or on every side of an urban agriculture site, create a compost site. And I like it because you don't have to have gasoline and a tractor. My compost site, I have a tractor and a compost turner. And of course, that means I'm more efficient at starting out with a 55-yard long windrow of manures and hays and straw and wood chips piled up, and I can turn it every day or every 2 days. It requires more management and fuel, but it does turn out good compost really quick, 6 to 8 weeks. And it can be done safely and effectively. I mean, you might worry about, varmints getting into, if you start trying to compost kitchen scraps. But if you have a very, very active worm bin with lots of worms in it, which takes a little time to build up, they can devour some kitchen scraps so fast. It's really almost miraculous to watch. Then, of course, you got to keep feeding them or they'll start dying off. And there's lots of systems to do that. And then you've got really nature's own system. Worm castings are perfect food. In fact, worms themselves don't digest the food. It's like all of the soil, any other composting system. It's the microbes in the worms or in your compost pile or in your soil that are doing the digesting. And that's why, can you bring up that one image of the soil food web? Stacy, I think. All right. Anyway, so that, and I want to just give a lot of credit to Dr. Elaine Ingham, who helped write the book, The Soil Biology Primer, and this image with some other people, and was at least one of the people doing the research. She's a PhD microbiologist, soil microbiologist, and actually ocean microbiologist as well. But really to understand what's under our feet. I mean, we all know what the food web is. We think of it as starting at our feet and going up. What is the bug eating? What's eating the bug? What's, what the bird's eating and the worm and but the soil food web, and even the food web in the ocean. I mean, whales get to be the size they are, and I can't remember how huge they get, but by eating the tiniest things, krill. So everything that we are, our bodies, and everything on the planet is 100% dependent and based on the soil food web. There was a study done once about the lifespan of the planet if all microbes went away all at once, and they said it was, this computer modeling said 6 hours, the rest of the planet would be dead. And I can't evaluate a computer simulation model. In fact, my computer skills are fairly low, which is okay with me. I have people to help me with that, like this. But anyway, as you can see here, you start with, I don't know if my cursor is being seen right now, but if you go from, well, right around the roots, it's called the rhizome of any plant. And that's the area of the most intense biological activity because, and I got to be careful not to get carried away with this part of it because it's the most interesting to me. But it's called the rhizome, and there the roots are pumping out by their interaction with the sun, photosynthesis. And this is where carbon begins to come in. Liquid carbon is pumped into the ground through the roots with some enzymes. And that's a much more detailed and interesting discussion, but I'll leave it at that. And there are messages in those enzymes telling the microbes, feeding the microbes, and it's carbon, right? So what else is carbon? Well, diamond rings. They don't have anything to do with diamond rings. Graphite. And the only other, as far as I know, the only other pure carbon is biochar, and I will spend at least a minute on that. I'll try to keep that short too, but biochar is really important. But for right now, so those root exudates go out, and the microbes get all happy because that liquid carbon is kind of like sugar. What's sugar? Carbon. It's not pure carbon, but it's carbon. So that's why I love cookies, because it's carbon, and we all need carbon. The UFOs flying by say, oh, there's the carbon-based planet. Everything on this planet, every living thing has carbon in it. In fact, Dr. Ingham says, it's milk and cookies for the microbes. And then the microbes retrieve out of the soil environment the nutrients that aren't available in the atmosphere. A lot of nutrients are stored in the atmosphere, but some are stored only in the soil. So they retrieve those. And when you have that healthy soil food web, and if you have inoculated your soil, and if you've fed your soil and taken care of those microbes, you will definitely have the most healthy plants, and you will have less bugs, less diseases, because everything that's super healthy fights off diseases and bugs. And bugs even have a radar in those big antennae. They know which plants are unhealthy, and those are the ones they're going to eat first, because it's their job to take out unhealthy so the healthy survive. But then, okay, so the bacteria is then eaten by the fungus, some funguses and some other, then the nematodes, and then the microarthropods and arthropods are eating something, nematodes are then eating something. So it's just a food chain. And behind me, over my shoulder, is my favorite poster. It looks like, I don't know, 30 different kinds of microbes that I was studying, because I did take one of Dr. Ingham's classes, and I have my own microscope, which I have not quite learned how to use properly. But one of these, when I retire for real, I'll do it. I tried to retire once, but couldn't quite do it. So then you get up to the soil, and then you get into the birds and the animals and us, but it's all based in the soil food web. So anyway, you can take that slide off. So I don't know if I'm on, but I don't see myself on the screen anymore, but I'll keep talking anyway. So a quick minute. How much time have I used? 7:35. Okay, I'm good. And so basically what I'm saying is human health is based on that soil food web. Every tree and shrub is based on that soil food web. The soil that we're losing still every day and every year is being lost because of the lack of a soil food web. A soil food web has a structure. And this can be done in a garden, in an urban agriculture setting, or on 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres. And so the soil food web, and keeping your soil covered during all seasons, either by cover crops, or by mulching or by your living plants that you're harvesting is a key piece to it, keeping the soil covered. A little piece about soil fertility. So soil is made up of sand, silt, and clay. And if you're a good gardener, it's made up of many organisms, microorganisms, and it's got a lot of organic matter. And then the soil horizons is another term soil scientists use. So the top layer is debris, like in a woods, leaf litter. So in your garden, it would be mulches or whatever's fallen off your plant. And then below that is, gosh, all of a sudden I'm going blank on I think the first layer is O, second layer is A. And anyway, I forget all what they're called, but somewhere down there's the subsoil. So you want to increase mostly the A horizon, which is the topsoil, and soil left to its own grows down. Or you can do what some people do when they call me to get me to deliver a garden for them. I build boxes, and some people want 2-foot tall boxes because they don't want to bend over. They've gotten old. So I'm giving them a 2-foot A horizon right out of the gate. And I put minerals in it. I put biology in it. I put biochar in it, and 50-50 sifted topsoil and compost. There's my secret. That's my proprietary formula. You all know it now. And then they're the instant hit of the neighborhood. They're experts. They're green thumbs. And again, a green thumb is not an inborn genetic characteristic. It's a little knowledge, the right techniques and products, and a little patience. So you can do it. So the soil horizons. Now it's important, I've mentioned it several times, but remineralizing. Most soils need remineralizing because, for example, out in the farm fields, well, every year they put NPK on. Now you've all seen a multivitamin bottle. There are how many items on there? 30, 40 trace minerals. Same thing the soil needs. So you just put NPK out there, you slowly, what we call mine the soils of the trace minerals. So you've got to put them back. So I have some products at my farm stand to do that also. And some of it's ground, fine granite. Some of it you can use seaweed, you can use other things, but you got to get that back in. Then you have to inoculate with these soil microbes. And I really love biochar for that because, and it's really great to research this, it'll kind of blow your mind. Biochar was at one time called Terra Preta in South America along the Amazon River Basin. And we rediscovered it there in these rich soils, which were abandoned when, I don't know who it was, some Spanish or Portuguese explorer left European diseases there. And the next time they came back, everybody was gone. They couldn't figure out why. They had no immunity to the diseases of Europe. But later, after that, we rediscovered these rich, fertile soils, which supported a pretty bigger all the time, according to archaeological research, civilizations. And in it was biochar, which they call terra preta. So it's the making of char, which can become charcoal, or it can become biochar, and it's microscopically porous. And again, I have to control myself and not talk about this too much. It's really significant. And I've even heard a NASA researcher from Langley was asked once to study carbon sequestration. She said the only carbon negative technique we have at our disposal is the making of char, biochar. Then you inoculate it because it's become so porous with all the beneficial microbes. You put it in your soil, and it also, here's the kicker, it lasts for a minimum of 500 years, and we've discovered versions of it that are 4,000 years old or even older, still carrying within it the spore form of all these bacteria and fungus. You put it in there, you only have to put it in once, and even if times get a little tough in your garden, you don't water it, and it gets dry and baked and nothing's growing, or it floods, they go back into spore form in these biochar crumbles, and then it stays there until it's called upon again by the action of those root exudates and a little moisture. And that's a great way to inoculate. Now, carbon sequestration on agriculture of any kind, I don't want to go too far into this, but if we took all of our farmland in this country and turned it into regenerative agriculture, which is the new word and I think more descriptive than organic or sustainable, and the numbers vary according to who you talk to, but we can sequester both through direct acquiring carbon in the soil by all these techniques, and by reducing the travel time of our food and all of the things. Some people, I mean, the numbers vary according to who you talk to, but some people say we could draw down 50% of the carbon out of the atmosphere through all of these things, which admittedly is a very tall order because of the entrenched interests of current agricultural, the big ag companies. But I'm not going to say exactly how much we could do. I'm going to research it a little more myself, but it's a big deal. And what we also do, this is really important, it's true in your garden or out in the big fields. For every 1% soil organic matter increase you get, it's a test you can do, you can absorb and hold another 1 inch of rain in your soil. And a good target, a lot of people who are into organics and sustainable and regen, is 5%. You have a lot of health going on when you have that, because it also accompanies this whole soil food web. But then you can hold a 5-inch rain in your soil. And I tried this as an example once to see how it went. I had some tomatoes I'd been harvesting for a month without watering, because I'd been doing some of these practices, and I also had a thick layer of mulch. And I just decided to keep going and see how long it lasted, that I could keep harvesting and not water. And I went 2 full months of harvest. And I was surprised at that, but that's the soil organic matter. That's the carbon sequestration. That's a pore structure, a porous structure that develops in your soil, and it doesn't blow away in the wind or in water erosion because of these glues that all the bacteria slowly release in their digestion and elimination. The only one I remember is called glomalin. And so you have these soil structures that are glued together. So that changes the water cycle immensely also. Boy, that's a big deal. So I can stop and take some questions now. I don't know if I adequately covered all those things, but I'll answer questions now. But I'll also just end by saying one more time how important I think this discussion is. And I mean, for me, there's no more important discussion about local agriculture, urban agriculture, teaching kids and bored adults how to grow their own garden. I didn't mention permaculture. Permaculture is an important piece to add to the discussion. I strongly believe in backyard hens, and Virginia Beach's city council still won't allow it. The other cities do. Anybody in Virginia Beach, call your city council members. So backyard hens, I mean, a local food system, 6 hens is great. A few fruit trees and nut trees. Start talking to churches and schools. Start going to the city elders about, empty lots. And there are plenty of them around. And you have the same way that regenerated soil is more resilient to dry or wet conditions or to other problems. The same in a decentralized food system isn't more resilient to problems, maybe in food coming from California or elsewhere. And what I didn't cover is season extension. Okay, that's easy. You have to like kale and collards a little more, and you can grow them right outside, right through the winter. I'm still picking kale, collards, Brussels sprouts, and broccoli out of our place over on Kempsville Road with no row covers, no greenhouses or anything. If you add greenhouses and row covers, and when I say greenhouse, I mean more what most people call hoop houses, which means unheated. They say you go one growing season south for one layer of plastic. So that puts us somewhere in South Carolina. But season extension is an important topic to cover sometime. So research your permaculture. It's really important. I think I've kind of covered everything else.
Okay, John, I'm going to ask one of the questions.
Okay.
Okay, talk about composting. Can you put food scraps in a compost bin? How do you know when the compost is done? And what should you never put in your compost bin?
Can you put food scraps in? Oh, yes, of course. You should put all of your food scraps in. Well, if you're in a home composting system, you definitely should avoid the meat and probably the cheese as well. In my compost operation down in Pungo, the temperature goes up to 140, 150, and everything disappears so quick. I can put anything in that. But in a home composting system or a worm bin, you should just do vegetable matter or rice and bread and things like that. And if you have a really active worm bin, for example, they eat that stuff so fast. I've watched some film footage of it, and it's kind of remarkable. So it depends upon your compost system. But yeah, in home composting, I do love the worms. I don't have to turn it. I don't have to do anything but throw the stuff in. And I have 2 prototypes that I just built. I have a shop also that I build things in. Make all the parts for the raised beds I build. And they're made out of 1/2-inch wire mesh and treated lumber. And the treatment is copper, so it doesn't get in. It's less volatile than what used to be the arsenic. But yeah, how do you know it's done? Well, if you're doing thermophilic and you're just making a pile, if you wait long enough, if your pile's on the ground, the earthworms, shockingly, even if you don't think you have any, will find you pretty quickly, and they'll help the process. And if you're only adding a little material at a time, then you don't have to turn it much, and those earthworms will do some of the job for you. If you add a lot of kitchen scraps, you want to keep a bale of straw or hay and go collect all your neighbor's leaves in the fall and add some browns into your kitchen scraps a little bit every so often, or every time you add a lot of kitchen scraps, and keep the percentage of carbon, which is what we're talking about, browns or carbon, to your kitchen scraps, which are generally considered nitrogen sources, but there's a lot of variations on that. And how do you know it's done? Well, even if you don't know, if it looks mostly done, as long as you've inoculated your garden well with compost and biochar, you can put unfinished or, almost finished or looks pretty good compost in your garden, and the garden will finish the job. Now, you don't want to put too much, I mean, you don't want to see, unless you're going to wait a while to grow in it. Some people do this, just bury kitchen scraps. But that does open you to rodents and stuff to come digging, and dogs and whatever. Anyway, so how do you know it's done? You can do expensive biological assay tests, and you can tell. And by the way, when you're making compost, your senses can tell you a lot. If you're making compost and it smells bad, you're making bad compost. It's gone anaerobic. You want aerobic compost, or you want to slow it way down by putting a lot of browns in. And then I just, again, love worms. And you can buy some of the worm bin things you can buy online are not that good because they don't allow enough oxygen in. The ones I'm building are a little bigger for the more ambitious among us, and plenty of oxygen gets in. So if you begin to smell your compost, and pick it up and smell it. If it smells neutral, soil-like, then it's probably done. And anyway, did I answer the question?
Yes, you did. How do you keep gnats out of the compost bin?
Well, so when I do the worm composting, if you get that worm population up really healthy, it kind of beats some of those things to the punch and takes away some of their food. Some of the gnats are fungus gnats, so they're going to get in there anyway. But I've just found both in the garden and when I have healthy compost, like my thermophilic compost, I just never have any problem with bugs because it just happens so fast. It gets so hot and is breaking down so fast, I don't have a problem. But in a home bin, honestly, I can't answer that really well. But I think the worms and turning help a lot. If you're doing thermophilic, which is just bacteria and fungus, turning a lot is helpful. And I'll think about that. Maybe if some of these questions aren't answered sufficiently, I'll do a little research and try to answer them and put them on the website here later as well.
Okay, I got a bunch of questions for you.
Okay, I can sit here all night if you want.
No, that's okay. What mulch do you recommend for tomatoes?
Say which thing am I
What
recommending?
mulch do you recommend?
Mulch? Okay. Well, first of all, again, I'm sorry to be a broken record, but you want your soil food web very active. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but the zone between the mulch and the soil is where you have the most dynamic biological activity. And it then carries fertility down, and worms come up and then carry stuff back down. And so, and that positive biological scenario doesn't allow for diseases. Sometimes mulches can be breeding grounds for disease organisms. So, but if you have the proper soil food web and it's aerobic, most diseases that hurt things are anaerobic. And I also spray compost tea, and I make really good compost tea, which has to be made out of really well-made compost. But I spray it on the leaf surfaces. But the best mulch, I like straw, even though I can't get organic straw. I'm so convinced that the good biology that is in my soils and compost, and there's a lot of research out on this, knows how to break down some of the compounds that might be still residues on the straw that's out there. But straw is easy for the microbes to break down. And the only downside to it is sometimes you have some leftover wheat berries in there that start to sprout. Those are the easiest thing in the world to pull out. and I've never experimented much with leaves for tomato mulch, but you can use cardboard also. But I particularly like straw because it ultimately adds a lot of organic matter to the soil. And by the end of the season, if you've put down 4 or 5 inches in the beginning of the season, you've only got an inch or a half inch left at the top because of all that activity in that zone between the mulch and the soil. So that's my favorite.
Okay. What are your top practical tips for preparing, maintaining a backyard vegetable garden?
Well, I'm trying this year on the site over at Farmer John's Market. I'm going to start working on no-till, no disturbing of the beds, permanent beds. And so one tip is about the more you disturb the soil, and rototillers are the worst. And yes, I still sometimes use a rototiller, but it's slice and dice on the worms and the mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria, and your soil has to build that back up. So I'm moving to no-till vegetable gardening, and I will. I'm going to keep records on that and try to show results. But in the meantime, practical tips: compost, and I hate to say it, but not all compost is created equal. There's some really crummy compost out there, and you can use the smell test, and then you can just see whatever you've used, how did it do for you. And my formula is 4 ingredients, and I do change it. But compost, good compost, and I turn it in. And if I had only one little garden, which eventually I'll retire to a garden. I tried to, but now I'm still on 2 acres. I was on 25 acres. Compost, trace minerals. I use a little bit of a composted chicken manure, which I have, which is 343. So it's low test, not a high number fertilizer. And the compost has fertility in it, so that's why I use the low numbers and not a lot of it, and less than recommended. And then I use biochar. And again, once you've used biochar once or twice, you don't have to use it again because the biochar in the soil is forever. Those 4 things, and then mulching. I mulch as much as I can. Some things I don't like to mulch because it does, some of your little tender lettuces don't like to be mulched, but I plant them in a diagonal hexagonal pattern so they're 12 inches on center all the way around, and it pretty soon creates a canopy over the whole soil, and now you've covered the soil. Again, cover the soil. And those are my primary tips. And I don't do much soil testing because when I used to, and I was following these exact same techniques, my soil guy would come back and say, well, I don't know what you're doing. Just keep doing it. Everything looks real good. And I remember one time he just said, you just need a little bit of, what was it? Manganese and 5 pounds per acre of boron, which 5 pounds an acre is like 1 granule for every footstep you take. So I tried to spread it out evenly, and what happens, and here's the important point: nature in any of its forms, including the soil ecosystem and any healthy ecosystem of a forest or a farm, is self-healing, self-recreating. That's why regenerative agriculture is a term. And it begins to make its own fertility. And it begins to be, your problems decrease, begins to get easier. So those are the 4 tips. And what I'm going to do in terms of the no-till, I've got some old brassicas that are out there. I'm not sure whether I'm going to just mow what's left or just cut the tops, leave the roots in, and then let those break down with the microbes, and then plant. If those were planted on 12-inch centers, I'm going to come back with something new and plant it in between each of those plants. But I'm going to add a little tiny 1/4 of a cup of my mixture and just dig in each of those spots. And then, I've left those roots in, and that's something good. The bacteria and fungus will love me for it. And you do have to plant a different type of plant in the crop rotation thinking. So if I had brassicas there, I might go back with lettuce or, anything other than a brassica. So there's those tips. All right, next.
I'm moving along here. When you do home composting, should you only use scraps from organic produce?
No, my belief is that we have to take care of everything. And I mean that in different ways. But specifically the way right now, if you have non-organic produce or anything else, there's still good stuff in there. It may not be as nutritionally dense when you ate the top and threw away the bottom or whatever, but there's goodies in there. And even if there's a little leftover chemical residue in it, again, the research is out. Those microbes know how to dismantle at the molecular level almost every toxin. And I'm going to research this, but I just saw it. Here's a tip. I've been watching a Soil Regen Summit myself. I always watch some of these programs. And through the Soil Food Web, they've just done it. And I think it's free, completely free. And they're recording them. You can go back and rewatch some of them. Someone on there said there's now they've discovered a microbe, which is, what was the term they used? Basically, it breaks down radiation residues. And I was like, wow, that's big. Like nuclear energy leftovers or something. And I don't want to talk about that too much until I look into it more, because that's such a big claim. But we already know, the research has been done for years and years, that the microbes in the compost and in the soil break down all of those toxins when you have the full soil food web in action. And so, yeah, I use everything. I'll compost most anything.
Okay, I'm going to ask about 3 more questions.
Okay.
One is, how do you keep rodents out of your compost?
Okay, my compost bins, whether I'm making a worm bin or a backyard, just thermophilic bin, I use 1/2-inch mesh galvanized screens, and it's on the bottom, it's on the sides, it's on the front and the back, it's on the lid, and I put a latch on the top where I feed material. I have yet to see even those very clever raccoons get into one of those. So your defense against the rodents has to be good. And yeah, the ones we're building in the shop, I know no raccoons are getting in. And 1/2-inch is too little for a mouse even to get in. So that's my defense there. And again, try not to put, in a home-based one, no meat scraps, because even if they don't get into your bin, that's just going to bring them around, those smells. And they got good sniffers. So that's how I keep them out.
Great. How do you regulate the temperature in a worm bin to keep it from getting too hot?
That is about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, the browns to greens. And the more browns you have, the slower the process goes. When you have too much nitrogen material, too much greens, it can get hot real quick, like a bag of grass clippings in a plastic bag. Now it can get hotter than you can imagine. And then it goes anaerobic real quick. And then you open it accidentally and might knock you over with the stench of the anaerobic decomposition. But so that has to do with the twofold. One, carbon to nitrogen ratio. And secondly, your worm population and how quick it's getting at your stuff. If you've really got a lot of worms, they don't wait around for it to get hot. And they'll just eat it up. So those are the two things there.
Okay, what do you think of mushroom compost? Good or not so much?
Well, so at the risk of sounding like I want everybody to buy my compost and nobody else's, it's okay, but not great. It depends upon where it came from. But I mean, it's a useful compost. I'll say that for sure. And it's cheaper than what I sell. But the problem with it can be that if you use too much of it, see, it's not actually, at least what I've encountered, is not actually composted. What it is, it's material that's coming out the back end of a mushroom bin, and then it's put on a truck and sent to you and sold. And I've even talked to a couple of people that sell it. They've said they've dug into one of their big piles of it, ready to sell. And, you know, just like steaming and hot and stinks. That's anaerobic decomposition. That means it's not mature compost. Now, if you use some of that that's gotten fresh to you and doesn't already stink to high heaven, and you put it in your garden, it's okay if you mix it in to your garden, and not in too high of a quantity. And then your soil microbes will finish the process for you, and then it's okay. And it's, I don't know, I've never looked at a test of it, but in that regard, it can be useful. And so I don't discourage people from using it, but if you go out to get some and you've got a pickup truck or something, go look at the pile, and you know, stick a shovel in it, throw it around a little bit. If it stinks to high heaven and is smoking and it's hot, well, see if it's better on the other side of the pile or something. But it's a good product, and I so strongly believe in using everything from everywhere that I just wouldn't discourage you. But I did have one person use 50-50 in a garden once, so it was half soil, and their whole garden died because, and then they went out there and stuck their hand in it, and it was hot, so it was decomposing. So I'm going to say, I don't know what percentage to say, but let's say 10% or something, and that might even be too much, but so that it gives, you know, it gives the soil a chance to incorporate it. And so anyway.
Okay. One last question then. What do you do if your compost is too wet?
Take your blow dryer out there. No, I'm kidding. So even like if you've got a backyard pile and it's just a pile on the ground or maybe even in a bin, and it's just rained and rained and rained like it has in January and February, if it's too wet, and so there's some variables here. If it was a lot of fresh material and it's just wet and wet and wet, then it's probably starting to go anaerobic. And I would use that, I would mix that with some fresh dry straw and kind of start over. But if it's just wet and it was older compost that was almost finished, then go ahead and use it. But I think I missed a thought in there that slipped away. But so yeah, so there's some variables in that. If it's a lot of fresh stuff and it's slimy and it's starting to go anaerobic, then add dry browns, mix it, and it'll recover. anaerobic compost can be recovered with proper care. And like on these worm bins I'm making, the screen on the top is wire also, but I'm also going to be putting right on top of, however high I've raised my material, something like a piece of 1/4-inch plywood or something so it drains off the water, so that, you know, I can regulate the moisture level of my compost that I'm making. And that is a good point. You want compost that ends up looking like 70% cocoa in terms of its color, and has a 50% soil water content. And you can test that. Again, some of the things you need to know about composting are not so scientific, even though I love the science of compost. But pick up a pile of it, squeeze it. If water drips out, it's too wet. If it falls apart in your hand, it's too dry. If it sort of stays clumped up, it's just right. So, and some of these things I couldn't answer completely unless I looked at your compost. And, but yeah, so I hope that answered that to some degree.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I will note that you got all kinds of compliments in the chat area. But I'm
Oh,
going to turn it
thank
back
you.
to Susan. Susan?
While we're waiting for Susan, I'm going to say something about.
I'm sorry, I need to unmute myself, sorry.
Okay, let me just say one last little tidbit.
Okay.
We've discovered, we collectively, not me and my friends, but scientists, some of the microbes that are in the soil that are necessary for life are some of the same microbes we need in our own physical microbiome. And healthcare professionals are more and more getting on board with how important the digestive soil microbiome is. And that's an important point to remember. When you eat a carrot you pulled out of the ground, and maybe you didn't completely thoroughly wash it, maybe just rubbed off the biggest chunks or something and eat that, or just rinsed it a little bit, that's good for you. That's really good for you. And one more thing, for home gardeners, one hard thing to get is good water, because you don't want to put chlorinated or water with chloramine in it, because you're promoting biology, and those chemicals are designed to kill biology in the pipes, which we want them to do. So I encourage people to collect rainwater or dig a well, or check with your city if you have chlorinated water, and they go back and forth, chloramine and chlorine. Chlorine off gases. So you can put it in a barrel, wait 24 hours and use that in your garden. Chloramine lasts a long time. And they switch it to break the resistance cycle in the pipes. So good water is important.
Okay, now I'm going to close up here.
Okay.
Thank you, John. It was an excellent presentation, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. Please remember to do the little survey at the end, and also remember that on the website, virginiabeachmastergardener.org, is a book list that John talked about earlier.